The baby of a poor maid crawled into the Mafia boss's meeting room. He'd made his order perfectly clear. Not a single person was to step inside while he met with an arms partner from Detroit. A $12 million deal. South Chicago territory. Every second in that room was worth blood. Until something small, soft, and silent slipped through the half-open door. A curly-haired baby with green eyes, sitting in the marble hallway, looked straight into the eyes of the man the entire Chicago underworld feared, and smiled. The baby lifted both arms, asking to be picked up, and what the Mafia boss decided to do next, no one could have imagined. If this story touched your heart, please tap like so more people can hear it. Share this video with anyone who needs to believe that love can change anyone, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Beckett Cole had given the order at 6 o'clock that morning. His voice was low and unhurried, each word falling like a stone dropped into still water. No one was to step onto the 3rd floor. No one was to walk down the east corridor. No one was to make a single sound. Not even the echo of footsteps against the marble floor he'd imported from Italy 3 years earlier. Fletcher stood outside the oak doors of the office, back straight, arms folded across his chest, his face as unreadable as a wall. 40 years old and absolutely loyal, Fletcher was the only man allowed to stand near that door when Beckett held a meeting. Not because Beckett trusted him, but because Fletcher was the only one who understood the consequences of betraying Beckett Cole and had chosen to stay anyway. Inside the office, Beckett sat behind a walnut desk as wide as a double bed. Light from the tall windows cut across the room, splitting his face in two, one half illuminated, the other buried in shadow. His gray eyes were cold as unpolished steel. His square jaw was set tight. On the back of his right hand, a long scar ran from the middle knuckle to his wrist, a remnant from the days when he'd carried things out himself, before he'd had enough men to do it for him. He didn't need to anymore. Now Beckett Cole only had to say a name, and that name would vanish from Chicago as if it had never existed. The large screen on the wall flickered to life. Dmitry Volkov's face appeared from Detroit, hard and angular, pale blue Slavic eyes staring into the camera as though assessing every thread in Beckett's suit. Volkov was an arms trafficker who controlled the entire shipping route from Detroit down through Gary, Indiana. This deal wasn't about money. $12 million was just a number on paper. This deal was about territory, about routes, about control of South Chicago, the control Beckett had been reaching for over the past 2 years. Every figure they exchanged carried blood behind it. Every percentage of shared profit represented streets, neighborhoods, human lives. Beckett spoke slowly and clearly, never repeating himself. He'd learned from his father, even though Patrick Cole had died on a warehouse floor 23 years earlier, that in this world the man who spoke the least was the most dangerous. Volkov nodded when Beckett gave the final number. They moved into the details of dividing the transport routes. Everything was unfolding perfectly. Every second aligned with Beckett's calculations. Until he heard it, very faint, almost imagined, a soft rustling from the hallway, as if something small were moving across the stone floor. Beckett didn't turn his head. He didn't move. Only his finger paused against the desk for a fraction of a second before resuming its steady rhythm. Volkov was discussing the schedule for the first shipment, his voice flat and mechanical, when the rustling came again. Closer, clearer, like something crawling, dragging gently across the marble, slow but determined, making its way toward his office door. Beckett felt his jaw tighten. Who? Who would dare? Fletcher was standing right outside. No one got past Fletcher without being stopped. So where was the sound coming from? Volkov stopped mid-sentence. His pale blue eyes narrowed slightly. Cole, is there a problem on your end? I don't like doing business with a man whose mind is elsewhere. His tone was even, but beneath it lay a warning. In their world, distraction meant weakness, and weakness meant death. Beckett held the camera's gaze without blinking. There's no problem, Volkov. Continue. His voice was calm as a frozen lake, but beneath the ice his anger was beginning to boil. Someone would pay for this interruption. Volkov studied him for another second, then continued. The final 15 minutes of the meeting passed, while Beckett divided his mind in two, one half handling Volkov, the other listening to the rustling that had stopped just outside the door. Whatever was out there had come very close. When Volkov spoke his final words, confirming the 12 million, confirming the territory, confirming everything Beckett had worked toward for 2 years, the screen went dark. The room fell silent. Beckett didn't exhale in relief. He didn't smile. He stood, pushed his chair back in one clean motion, and walked toward the door, his jaw tight and his gray eyes colder than at any moment during the meeting. Someone had violated his order. Someone had nearly jeopardized the most important deal of his career. And in Beckett Cole's house, that never happened twice. He gripped the handle, turned it, and pulled the door open, his cold and precise fury already sharpened, perfected over 2 decades in Chicago's underworld. But when the door swung wide and his gray eyes lowered to the marble hallway floor, everything he'd prepared in his mind vanished. Completely. Instantly. As if it had never been there at all. A baby. Sitting in the middle of the marble hallway, imported from Carrara, on a floor where each tile cost more than most people in this house earned in a month. A baby dressed in a faded, pale pink onesie, white socks that didn't match, one higher than the other, brown curls just long enough to fall in a soft tangle across the forehead, and the eyes. Wide green eyes, clear as spring water, staring straight at Beckett Cole without blinking, without fear, without hesitation, as if he were the most fascinating thing this child had seen in its brief life. Then the baby smiled. Not the polite smile adults use to hide their intentions. This was the smile of a creature that didn't yet know how cruel the world could be. A wide, unguarded grin, 2 tiny baby teeth pushing up from the lower gum, a wrinkled nose, eyes curving into crescents, a soft giggle spilling out, light as wind chimes in a quiet morning. Beckett couldn't speak, not because he chose silence, but because his mind, the mind that had calculated life and death 1,000 times over 2 decades, was suddenly empty. There was no script for this, no countermeasure, no strategy, just a baby sitting on his floor, smiling at him as if he weren't the man the entire underworld of this city feared. What is? That was all he managed. 2 words. The man who'd never left a sentence unfinished in his life had just trailed off in front of an 8-month-old child. The baby answered with an excited stream of nonsense syllables, as if his deep voice were the most delightful invitation to conversation in the world. Then it lifted both arms, tiny chubby fingers opening and closing in the air, a universal gesture understood by anyone on Earth. Pick me up. Beckett took a step back, instinctively, the same instinct that had helped him dodge bullets, avoid knives, survive everything that could kill a man. He stepped back from a child who weighed less than 18 pounds as if it were the most dangerous threat he'd ever faced. And maybe it was, because Beckett Cole had never held a baby. Not once, 37 years alive. He'd held a gun before he'd held a driver's license. He'd watched his father die before he'd finished high school. He'd run an empire before most of his peers had finished college. But he'd never, not a single time, cradled an infant. He didn't know how to support the head, didn't know what angle was right, didn't know if he might break something fragile by holding too tight. And he was afraid. Beckett Cole, who didn't fear Volkov, didn't fear Walsh, didn't fear death, was afraid of an 8-month-old baby. But the baby wasn't afraid of him. Not at all. When Beckett stepped back, it didn't cry or turn to look for someone else. It began to crawl, toward him, tiny palms pressing against the cold marble, knees dragging behind, its whole small body swaying in the uneven rhythm of a creature newly acquainted with movement. Slow, clumsy, determined, completely determined, as if nothing in this world could prevent it from reaching where it wanted to go. And where it wanted to go was Beckett Cole. It crawled to his shoes. Stopped, tilted its head back, green eyes lifting to meet his gray ones, and raised its arms again. The same gesture, the same request. Pick me up. No fear, no doubt, only absolute trust that the man standing before it would do the right thing. And Beckett Cole, a man who'd never done the right thing unless it benefited him, who'd spent a lifetime building walls between himself and anything that could touch his heart, who'd sworn never to let anyone or anything make him weak, did something utterly inexplicable. He knelt down, slowly, both knees touching the cold stone, his face level with the baby's. It looked at him. He looked back. Then he slid his hands beneath those tiny arms and lifted the child. It was so light he almost didn't feel the weight. Warm, soft, carrying the scent of powder and milk and something sweet he didn't have a name for. The baby rested its head against his shoulder immediately, as if that was exactly where it belonged, as if it had always known that this shoulder, the shoulder of Chicago's Mafia boss, was the safest place in the world. One small hand clutched the fabric of his white shirt, gripping tight, as though afraid of being let go. And then, In less than a minute, the baby's breathing slowed, evened out, grew heavier. It fell asleep. Against his chest. Against the chest of Beckett Cole. He stood there in the marble hallway, inside a mansion where every corner was steeped in money and secrets and blood, holding a nameless child sleeping peacefully on his shoulder, and he felt something inside his chest crack. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a thin fracture, fine as a strand of hair, running along the wall he'd spent 37 years building. Small, almost invisible, but he knew, with the instinct of a man who'd survived everything, that the crack would never seal again. "Give me my child." The voice came from the end of the hallway, trembling yet sharp as a freshly honed blade. Beckett looked up. A woman stood there about 10 steps away, her back pressed to the wall as if her legs no longer had the strength to hold her upright without support. Her skin was pale, so pale he could see the faint blue veins along her temples. Brown hair was pulled back in haste, loose strands clinging to her damp forehead. Her eyes were red, dark circles heavy beneath them, and her hands were shaking hard enough that Beckett could see it even from that distance. She wore a maid's uniform, the pale gray one Ramona had ordered for the household staff, and Beckett realized he'd never truly looked at this woman before. She'd been one of the quiet figures moving through the mansion, mopping floors, cleaning kitchens, folding towels, existing at the edge of his vision without ever being important enough for him to register, until this moment, because in this moment, the thin, trembling woman at the end of the corridor didn't look like a shadow. She looked like an animal cornered against a wall, frightened to the bone yet ready to tear apart anything that threatened her child. And what truly surprised Beckett wasn't the fear in her eyes. It was what lay behind it. She knew who he was. She knew what Beckett Cole was. She knew what happened to those who broke the rules in this house, and she walked toward him anyway, one step at a time, slow but unyielding, straight toward him, toward the baby sleeping against his chest. Not the walk of someone coming to beg. It was the walk of a mother, and Beckett realized with a chilling clarity that if he didn't hand the baby over, this woman would try to take her. No matter who he was, no matter what it meant. She would die here on this marble floor if that was the price of keeping her daughter safe. "Give me my child," she repeated, closer now, only 3 steps away. Her voice still shook, but it wasn't a plea. It was an order. And Beckett Cole, the man no one on this earth dared to command, the man even Volkov addressed with diplomatic restraint, stood there with a sleeping baby on his chest, and felt something he'd never felt in front of any rival. Respect. Not the kind reserved for power or money, the most primitive kind. The kind reserved for a creature willing to fight to the death for the purest instinct in the world. The instinct to protect its young. He looked at her. She looked back. No lowered gaze. No avoidance. For the first time in as long as he could remember, someone in this house met his eyes without permission. He could hand the baby over. Perhaps he should, but when he shifted slightly, the baby tightened her grip on his white shirt, as if even in sleep, she sensed the movement and refused to let go. That tiny hand, 5 soft fingers twisted into the fabric, held Beckett Cole more effectively than any chain ever could. He looked down at the small fist, then back at the woman. She'd stopped moving, her eyes fixed on her daughter, and Beckett saw something change in her face as she took in the sight of the child sleeping peacefully against his chest. The fear was still there, but beside it was something else. Confusion, because the baby wasn't crying. The baby wasn't struggling. The baby was fast asleep on the shoulder of Chicago's Mafia boss, as if it were the safest place on earth. And the mother didn't understand why. Beckett didn't understand either. But he knew one thing. He needed answers. He needed to know why there was a baby in his house, why this child knew how to crawl to his office as if she'd been here long enough to learn the way, and why the woman standing before him looked as though she hadn't slept a full night in months. "Sit down," Beckett said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. In this house, when Beckett Cole spoke at a normal volume, people listened more closely than when anyone else shouted. "Explain." The woman stood there, looking at him, at her daughter, back at him again, and Beckett could see her calculating, not with cold ambition, but with the desperate arithmetic of a mother weighing 2 equally terrible choices: snatch her child and run, or stay and face the most powerful man in Chicago. At last, on legs that still trembled, she walked to a chair along the hallway and sat, back straight, hands clenched tightly in her lap, eyes never leaving her daughter on Beckett's chest for even a second, ready to lunge at any moment. ready to die at any moment. "My name is Willa," she said, her voice rough. "Willa Byrne. I'm your maid, and the baby on your chest is my daughter, Josie." Willa began to speak, not in long, winding explanations, not in excuses, not in pleas for mercy. She spoke in short, clean sentences that fell into the silent hallway like bullets hitting concrete. 3 months. That was her first sentence. "I've hidden her in your laundry room for 3 months. Beckett didn't speak, didn't react. He simply stood there with Josie asleep against his chest, watching Willa with unreadable gray eyes and waiting. Willa swallowed and continued. "I come in at 6 every morning through the service entrance by the kitchen. Josie always falls asleep on the way. I lay her down in the laundry room on a thin mattress I bring from home. A few toys, the kind that don't make noise, cheap plastic ones I found at a thrift store. A cracked baby bottle I wrapped with tape around the rim so it wouldn't leak. She drinks from that bottle every day, 3 times a day." She paused, drawing in a breath as if she needed to gather strength for what came next. "Ramona knows. She's known since the first week. She saw the baby bag and asked me straight out. I told her the truth because I didn't have another choice. Ramona didn't tell you. She helped me watch the clock. She told me when you were out of the house, when you were on the 3rd floor, when it was safe for me to run down and feed her. The gate guard knows. The delivery man knows. They all know." No one said anything. Silence settled between them. Beckett processed the information the way he processed everything in his life. Cold and precise, piece by piece. 3 months, 90 days. A flawless system of quiet complicity operating beneath his own roof, inside the mansion where he believed not even a fly could pass unnoticed. The gate guard he paid generously. The delivery man he nodded to each morning. Ramona, the 58-year-old housekeeper who'd served the Cole family for 30 years. All of them had kept the secret. Not out of fear of Willa, not for personal gain, but because they pitied a single mother who had no one in the world. That pity had created something Beckett's money and fear never could. Real loyalty. "Why?" Beckett asked. Just one word. Willa looked at him, and he could see her deciding how much to reveal. Then perhaps she understood that at this point, hiding anything more no longer mattered. "Because I have no one," she said quietly. "My mother passed away when I was 19, leaving me with no family and nowhere to call home." Willa paused, her gaze dropping to her hands clenched in her lap. "After she died, I drifted. No family, no home, nothing. Then I met Troy." The name left her mouth like spoiled food. Troy Landis, handsome, sweet. He said exactly what a 22-year-old orphan needed to hear. "I married him," she inhaled slowly. "On our wedding night, he hit me for the first time." The sentence fell into the hallway and lay there, heavy, untouched. "I thought it was an accident. He was drunk. He apologized. He bought flowers. I believed him." Willa lifted her eyes to Beckett, and there were no tears there. Only the emptiness of someone who'd used them all up long ago. 4 years. 4 years of bruises, broken bones, apologies, flowers, then bruises again. A cycle. I forgot what my life looked like before him. Josie stirred faintly against Beckett's chest, her face tightening in sleep before softening again. Her small hand never loosened its grip on his shirt. "Then I got pregnant," Willa said, her voice lower now, almost a whisper. "I thought everything would change. I thought when he knew there was a baby, he'd stop. Foolish women always think that." She gave a small laugh that carried no joy at all. 6 months along. He was drunk. I said something wrong. He kicked me in the stomach. A silence followed so deep Beckett could hear the faint rhythm of Josie's heartbeat against him. I lay on the kitchen floor, holding my belly, and for the first time in 4 years, I didn't think about myself. I thought about her, the baby inside me, and I knew if I stayed one more day, one of us would die. Willa looked straight into Beckett's eyes. I grabbed my bag and left. That night, 7 months pregnant. No money, no phone, nowhere to go. I just knew I had to leave. She drew in a long breath, as if diving underwater. I gave birth to Josie alone in a shelter in Gary, Indiana, alone on an iron bed, in a room with 6 other women. There was no crib for her, no blanket. When the nurse placed Josie on my chest for the first time, she was shaking from the cold. I took off my coat and wrapped her in it because it was the only thing in this world I had to give my daughter. Willa stopped. For the first time her voice trembled. An old coat. frayed collar. It smelled like sweat and tears. That was my daughter's first blanket, and I lay there all night holding her inside that coat, watching her breathe. And I swore that no matter what I had to do, even if it meant hiding her in the laundry room of Chicago's Mafia boss, I would never let anyone hurt her again. The hallway grew so quiet Beckett could hear the ticking of a clock 2 rooms away in the living room. Josie still slept. Her tiny hand still clutched his shirt. And Beckett Cole, a man who'd heard every kind of lie and every kind of truth in his lifetime, knew with absolute certainty that every word Willa Byrne had spoken was true. Every sentence. Every word. Every drop of blood and tear behind them. He didn't speak. Not yet. Because for the first time in many years, Beckett Cole didn't know what he should say. The silence stretched between them long enough for Willa's trembling to grow worse. She'd said everything. Laid it all bare. And now she sat there waiting for a sentence from the man holding her daughter against his chest. The man who could end her life with a single phone call. And there was nothing she could do but wait. Beckett looked at her. For a long time. He looked at her, hands clenched in her lap until her knuckles turned white. Looked at the faint shake in her shoulders beneath the gray uniform. Looked at the eyes trying to hold back tears that had run dry long before she stepped into this hallway. Then he spoke. "I'm not going to kill you," Willa blinked. "I'm not going to fire you either." The second sentence landed heavier than the first. Willa stared at him as if he'd spoken in a language she didn't understand. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. And when words finally came, they weren't gratitude or relief. They were suspicion. "What do you want in return?" Her voice was flat, stripped of emotion, like someone who'd learned that everything in this world comes with a price. Beckett understood that question, more deeply than she realized. He lived in a world where no one gave anything for free. Every favor was a debt, every kindness a chain. He understood why, she asked. Because in Willa Byrne's life, powerful men never gave without taking. Troy Landis had given her a house and taken her ribs in return. The world had given her a child and taken almost everything else. Of course she would ask. Of course she wouldn't believe him. "I don't want anything," Beckett said. Willa held his gaze without blinking. She didn't believe him. Not at all. And he didn't blame her. "Mr. Beckett." A third voice came from behind them. Beckett turned. Ramona stood at the end of the corridor, hands folded neatly at her waist, spine straight as a ruler. 58 years old, silver hair twisted into a precise bun, stern face. But her deep brown eyes held something Beckett hadn't recognized until this moment. Understanding. She'd known him since he was a 14-year-old boy with his father's blood on his hands. She'd known him when his mother left. She'd watched each layer of armor he'd put on over 2 decades. And she was the only person in this house who met his eyes without bowing her head. "I knew you'd find out," Ramona said. "Sooner or later. And I knew you wouldn't dismiss her." Beckett narrowed his eyes. "You knew. Based on what?" Ramona didn't look away, didn't flinch. "Because you're not your father." 5 words. 5 words that struck Beckett harder than any bullet he'd ever dodged. Patrick Cole, his father. Mafia boss of North Chicago for 20 years. A large man with hands like shovels and eyes that never warmed. Beckett remembered the smell of cigarettes clinging to his father's suit jacket. Remembered the heavy footsteps on the stairs late at night. Remembered the way his father looked at him like a long-term investment instead of a son. Patrick Cole never forgave. Never gave second chances. Never softened for anyone or anything. And Patrick Cole had died on a cold warehouse floor with 4 bullets in his chest, right in front of his 14-year-old boy. Beckett remembered the blood, the smell of gunpowder, the way his father looked at him in that final second without saying a word. Not "I love you," not "be strong," not anything at all, just a look. Then his eyes closed. 5 years before that, his mother had gone first. Diane Cole. Not murdered, not kidnapped. She'd simply vanished. One morning, 9-year-old Beckett walked into the kitchen and found her closet empty. No letter, no explanation, no message. Just empty hangers swaying slightly and the faint trace of her perfume still clinging to a pillow. He'd stood in front of that empty closet for a long time. Long enough to learn the first and most important lesson of his life. That people leave. That affection is the weakest currency in the world. And that the only way to never be abandoned again is to never let anyone close enough to leave. After his father died, the organization raised him. Taught him to shoot before 16. Taught him to count money before 18. Taught him to control men through fear before 20. But no one taught him how to love. No one taught him how to trust. No one taught him how to face a baby sleeping against his chest and a woman looking at him with wary eyes. "Take me to the laundry room," Beckett said abruptly. Willa stared at him in shock. Ramona nodded as if she'd expected those words all along. They went downstairs. Beckett still held Josie, walking carefully so he wouldn't wake her. When the laundry room door opened, he saw everything. The thin mattress spread in the corner between the washer and dryer, so thin he could see the outline of tile beneath it. 3 plastic toys arranged neatly beside it. A faded yellow duck, a clear teething ring, a soft ball small enough to fit in his palm, the cracked bottle wrapped in tape next to a nearly empty container of formula, a single thin blanket folded with care. That was all. That was Josie Byrne's entire world for 90 days. A corner of a laundry room between 2 industrial machines in the mansion of the wealthiest mafia boss in Chicago. Anger rose in Beckett. Not anger at Willa, not at Ramona or the gate guard, or any of the quiet accomplices. Anger at himself. Because he'd lived in this house for 2 years, passed this door hundreds of times, and never once looked inside. Because he controlled everything from shipping routes, to bank accounts, to human lives, yet couldn't control his own blindness. Because a baby had lived beneath his roof for 3 months, and he hadn't known. And anger at the world. At a world that pushed a 27-year-old woman to the point where hiding her child between a washer and dryer in a killer's house was the safest option she had to earn enough money for milk. He didn't speak. He turned and walked out. Willa watched him go, not knowing what it meant. That night, Beckett lay in the king-sized bed in the master suite. Egyptian silk sheets, goose-down pillows, a cashmere blanket, a bedroom larger than the entire apartment Willa and Josie rented. And for the first time in 37 years, Beckett Cole lay on the most expensive bed money could buy, staring at the ceiling in the dark, and felt the room was too large, too empty, too quiet for one man. In the days that followed, Beckett didn't mention any of it. Not Josie, not the laundry room, not the story about the old coat and the shelter in Gary, Indiana. He went to work, held meetings, signed papers, made calls, ran his underground empire as if that morning had never happened. But something had shifted, quietly, without spectacle, like a crack in a wall spreading over time where the naked eye can't quite see it. Beckett began to listen, not in the professional, sharpened way he'd trained himself for 2 decades, the instinct that caught unfamiliar footsteps, the click of a lock, the faint scrape of metal against metal. This was different. Each morning when Willa arrived at 6 through the service entrance, Beckett lay in bed and listened to the soft turn of a key in the lock. Listened to her careful footsteps across the kitchen floor, the steps of someone used to making herself invisible. Listened to the rustle of her bag, the zipper opening, the bottle being taken out, and then, faint and drowsy, Josie's small murmur as she was lifted from her carrier to the thin mattress downstairs. He could smell the milk. It made no sense. People don't hear scent. And yet each morning when he passed the hallway leading to his office, the warm, powdery trace of formula lingered in the air, and he paused, every time. Just a second, breathing in, then walking on, and the lullabies Willa sang when she thought no one could hear. So softly it was barely more than breath shaped into melody. He didn't recognize the song. Maybe it wasn't a song at all, just notes a mother invented in the dark, so her child would sleep. But that fragile sound slipped through walls, through closed doors, through 20 years of armor Beckett Cole had built around himself, and settled somewhere in his chest he didn't want to acknowledge. He began canceling meetings. Not all of them, just the ones that could be postponed. Lunches with partners that weren't urgent. Social obligations he'd always despised but attended out of duty. Now he found reasons not to go. He worked from home more often. In his office on the 3rd floor, the door sometimes left open a few inches, just enough for the sounds of life downstairs to drift up. Fletcher noticed. Of course he noticed. 40 years old, loyal to the point of blindness, but not a fool. He gave Beckett strange looks each time another meeting was canceled, but he said nothing, until the 5th day after the incident. That afternoon, Fletcher stood in front of Beckett's desk, arms folded, delivering a report. Marco Pellini, 3 months behind on payments. Large sum, promised, then disappeared. 2 warnings already delivered. He still hasn't paid. According to procedure, the next step is... He didn't need to finish. They both knew what the next step was. In Beckett Cole's world, after 2 warnings, there was never a third. Beckett opened his mouth to give the order. The words were already there, familiar as breath, because he'd spoken them hundreds of times. But at that exact moment, from downstairs, through wood and brick and floorboards, came a sound. Josie's laughter, clear and bubbling, round as soap bubbles in sunlight. The laughter of a baby discovering something wondrous. Maybe a toy, maybe her own toes, maybe nothing more than the miracle of being alive at 8 months old. Beckett stopped, looked down at his hand, resting on the desk, the hand with the long scar. The same hand that morning had brushed against Josie's foot as he passed the laundry room. Just for a second, a small, warm foot peeking off the edge of the mattress, so tiny he could have closed his whole palm around it. "Give him 2 more weeks," Beckett said quietly. Fletcher went still long enough that Beckett lifted his eyes. His lieutenant was looking at him with something Beckett had never seen in 15 years. Confusion. "You've never given anyone more time." Fletcher's tone was flat, but the question lay beneath it. "I am now," Beckett replied, and his voice ended the discussion. Fletcher held his gaze another second, then nodded and left without another word. But Beckett saw the tension in the man's shoulders as he stepped through the door. In their world, mercy was the first sign of collapse. Late that afternoon, Beckett was reviewing contracts when he glanced at the small security monitor on his desk. Willa was wiping down the kitchen counter, movements steady and mechanical, when her phone vibrated in her pocket. She froze, pulled it out, looked at the screen, and everything changed. Her face drained of color in less than a second. The kind of white Beckett had seen on men moments before they were shot. The white of primal fear, etched into bone. She silenced the call immediately, slipped the phone back into her pocket. Her hands shook so badly the cloth fell to the floor and she didn't pick it up right away. Her eyes darted to the kitchen window, then to the hallway, then to the floor. The look of an animal that has caught the scent of a predator but doesn't yet know from which direction it's coming. Then she picked up the cloth and continued wiping, as if nothing had happened, but her shoulders were tighter, her movements faster, and her gaze kept returning to the window. Beckett sat very still, eyes fixed on the monitor. He catalogued everything, the expression, the reaction time, the way she ended the call, the way she scanned the room. 20 years in the underworld had taught him to read fear like an open book. Someone was frightening Willa Byrne. Someone outside this house was reaching into her life, and she was trying to hide it. He didn't ask. Not yet. Beckett Cole never asked without sufficient information. But that night, after Willa and Josie had left and the mansion had sunk back into the hollow silence he now realized he hated, Beckett sat before the security system and replayed the footage of the day, not out of habit, not out of duty, but because he wanted to know who had called her, who had made her hands shake, who had put fear into the eyes of the woman who'd stood in his hallway and ordered him to give me my child. And for the first time in his life, Beckett Cole wanted to protect someone not for leverage, not for strategy, not for debt or loyalty, but simply because he wanted to. That Friday, Beckett did something he'd never done in his entire career, canceled a meeting with a West Coast trafficking partner. A meeting Fletcher had arranged for 2 weeks. A meeting that under any normal circumstance Beckett wouldn't have missed. Fletcher glanced at him in the rearview mirror as he drove him back to the mansion at 2 p.m, 4 hours earlier than usual, and Beckett saw the question in his lieutenant's eyes, but Fletcher was wise enough to keep his mouth shut. When Beckett stepped inside, Willa was wiping the living room windows. She turned, startled to see him, and immediately set the bottle of glass cleaner down, as if she'd been caught doing something wrong. It was her reflex whenever he appeared unexpectedly, shrinking slightly, trying to make herself smaller, invisible. The reflex of someone who'd been hit enough times to know that the presence of a powerful man in the room rarely meant anything good. Beckett recognized it, and it hurt somewhere inside him he hadn't known existed. "Sit down," he said. "I need to talk to you." Willa sat on the edge of the sofa, back straight, hands clasped in her lap, the same posture she'd had that day in the hallway, the posture of someone waiting for a verdict. Beckett sat opposite her, took out his phone, and opened a list he'd spent the last 3 days compiling in the spaces between Mafia meetings and calls with Volkov. There are 3 daycare centers nearby with openings. The first is 15 minutes on foot from here, and has a support program for low-income single mothers. The second is farther but offers a full scholarship option. The third is the best of the 3. I've spoken to the director, filled out the preliminary application, negotiated the tuition, He placed the phone on the table between them. And I'm increasing your salary by 40%. Enough to cover daycare and still leave something for emergencies. Silence. Willa looked at the phone, then at Beckett, then back at the phone, and then she said a word Beckett hadn't anticipated. No. He blinked. In his world, no one said no to Beckett Cole. No one. Not Volkov, not Walsh. Not even men on their knees begging for their lives dared to say no. But the thin woman in the gray maid's uniform looked him in the eye and said it without hesitation. I won't accept it, Willa said. Her voice didn't tremble. For the first time since he'd known of her existence, Willa Byrne's voice didn't shake at all. The last time a man gave me something without explaining why, I ended up with broken ribs and 4 years in hell. She held his gaze, and Beckett saw something in her eyes he'd missed before. Fire. Not a blazing flame. The kind that smolders beneath ash, burning for years unseen beneath layers of fear and exhaustion. I don't need anyone to save me, she said, each word clear and deliberate, as if she'd rehearsed the sentence 1,000 times but never had the chance to speak it. I need you to tell me the truth. What do you want? What do you really want? Because if I accept something I don't understand again, I'll never forgive myself. In that moment, Beckett Cole looked at Willa Byrne, and for the first time, didn't see a victim. Didn't see a trembling woman crushed by life. Didn't see an orphaned girl beaten by her husband. He saw a warrior. Someone who'd walked through every circle of hell life could offer, and was still standing here, looking the Mafia boss of Chicago in the eye, and refusing kindness, because she didn't believe in kindness without cost. And she was right. Completely right not to believe. The world had taught her that lesson in blood and broken bones. Beckett drew in a slow breath. I don't know why I'm doing this, he said, and it was perhaps the most honest sentence he'd spoken in 20 years. I'm not a good man. You know who I am. You know what I do. I'm not pretending to be something I'm not. He paused, glancing down at his scarred hand. But I saw the thin mattress in the laundry room. I saw the cracked bottle wrapped in tape. I saw 3 cheap plastic toys lined up beside a washing machine, and I can't pretend I didn't see it. That's the only reason I have. Willa studied him for a long time, long enough that Beckett felt exposed in a way no bullet, no knife, no rival had ever made him feel. Then she nodded once, slowly. All right, she said, but if you change your mind, if you ever want something back, I'll leave. I'll leave without waiting to be fired. That's my condition. Fair, Beckett replied. A beat of silence passed. Then he spoke again, his voice lower than usual, almost hesitant in a way he hadn't known he was capable of. I'd like to see Josie, if you'll allow it. Willa looked at him, unreadable, then stood. They walked down to the laundry room in silence. When she opened the door, Beckett saw the familiar scene that was now etched into his memory, the thin mattress, the plastic toys, the taped bottle, and Josie lying on her back, arms and legs spread like a small starfish, mouth slightly open, sleeping with the absolute peace only children possess. Beckett knelt beside the mattress, gently, slowly, as if any sudden movement might shatter the moment. He extended his hand, resting his index finger beside Josie's tiny palm, and in her sleep, without opening her eyes, without waking, Josie closed her hand around his finger, 5 small fingers curling around one large one, holding tight, natural as breathing, as if that small hand had known his finger for a long time. Beckett didn't breathe. Didn't move. He simply looked at her hand wrapped around his finger and felt the crack in his chest widen a little more. When they went back upstairs, Willa paused at the laundry room door. She checked the lock, turned the handle, pulled once, then checked again, and again, 3 times. Beckett stood a few steps away, watching. Who are you afraid of? He asked. His voice was quiet, not threatening, but direct. Willa turned, her face composed. No one. 2 words. Clean, firm, and completely untrue. Beckett knew the way he knew the smell of gunpowder, the sound of a round chambering, every subtle shade of deceit on a human face, because reading lies was his profession. Willa Byrne was lying. She was afraid of someone specific, someone whose name on a phone screen was enough to drain the color from her face. And for the first time, Beckett didn't press further. Not because he didn't want to know, but because he knew that when the time was right, he would find out. He always did. And when he did, whoever was making Willa Byrne afraid like that would wish they'd never existed at all. On Monday morning, Willa Byrne did something she hadn't done in 3 months of working in this mansion. She walked to the front door, not the small service entrance by the kitchen, the hidden door meant for staff, meant for the invisible, the door she'd used every morning at 6, like a ghost who knew her exact hour. That morning she stood before the main entrance, the heavy double oak doors with brass handles polished daily, doors she'd never imagined she had the right to touch. Josie rested in her arms, wrapped in a pale pink blanket, thumb in her mouth, green eyes wide as she studied the world. The doorbell hadn't even finished ringing before the door opened. Beckett stood there. He'd opened it himself. Not Ramona. Not the security system. Him. White shirt, collar unbuttoned, coffee cup in hand. And Willa realized with a quiet shock that he'd been waiting. He'd been standing there expecting her. On his face, usually cold as carved stone, there was something different. Not a smile. Beckett Cole wasn't a man who smiled in the morning, but the absence of coldness, a small gap in the wall where light could pass through. "Follow me," he said. No explanation, no elaboration. He simply turned and walked down the hallway into the house. Willa followed, instinctively holding Josie tighter. She'd walked that hallway hundreds of times to mop the floors, but today it looked different. Maybe because for the first time she wasn't walking as a shadow. Maybe because for the first time she'd entered through the front door. Beckett stopped at the empty room beside the kitchen. A square room Willa knew well from weekly cleaning, bare and purposeless, unused space in a house too large for one man. He opened the door, and Willa Byrne, the woman who'd given birth alone in a shelter, who'd wrapped her child in an old coat because she had no blanket, who'd hidden her daughter between a washer and dryer for 90 days, looked inside and forgot how to breathe. Foam mats covered the floor wall to wall, blue, yellow, red, orange, interlocked like oversized puzzle pieces. A white wooden crib stood in the corner with a thick mattress, cloud-patterned sheets, and a soft folded blanket inside. Beside it was a changing table, stocked with diapers, wipes, rash cream, everything arranged with the precision Willa recognized as Beckett's style. Order in all things, even baby diapers, toys, not 3 cheap plastic ones from a thrift store, a whole basket of them, sensory toys, teething toys, soft stacking blocks, musical toys, each labeled for the appropriate age. And Willa knew, just from the careful selection, that someone had spent hours researching what an 8-month-old needed. Above the crib hung a mobile, small fabric stars and moons turning slowly in the soft current of air from the window. Gentle, tender, entirely out of place in the world of Beckett Cole. Willa couldn't speak. She stood in the doorway, holding Josie, staring at the room, and her knees gave way. Not fainting, not collapsing, just her legs refusing to keep her upright in the face of what she was seeing. She lowered herself onto the foam mat in the center of the room, Josie still in her arms, and tears slid down her face without resistance. "When I gave birth to Josie in that shelter," she said, her voice breaking apart, "she had nothing. No crib, no blanket, no toys. I took off my coat and wrapped her in it, because it was all I had." She looked around the room again, at the white crib, at the toys, at the slow-turning mobile overhead. The nurse said she was healthy, but I cried all night, because I knew my daughter deserved more than that, more than a frayed coat that smelled like sweat, and I couldn't give her more. Josie, blissfully unaware of tears and old pain, squirmed to be put down. Willa set her on the foam mat, and Josie immediately crawled off, quick and eager, little hands slapping the bright surface, laughter bubbling up as she discovered something new. She reached the toy basket, pulled out a soft teddy bear, hugged it, and laughed with the clearest sound Beckett had ever heard. Beckett, standing in the doorway, did something he'd never done anywhere in this house. He sat down on the floor, on the foam mat, legs stretched out, back against the wall, in expensive trousers and a crisp shirt he didn't care about wrinkling. For the first time in 2 years, Beckett Cole sat on the floor of his own home. Josie spotted him, dropped the bear, and crawled straight over, climbed onto his lap. He let her sit there, her back against his chest, her small legs stretched over his, the teddy still clutched in her hands. Willa watched them from the center of the room, tears still on her cheeks but no longer sobbing. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and drew in a steady breath. In the quiet that followed, Josie decided to explore again. She slid off Beckett's lap, crawled toward Willa, then changed her mind and turned back toward Beckett, wobbling midway and tipping to one side, about to fall. Both adults reached out at the same time. Instinct. No thought. 4 hands met at Josie's back to steady her. And in the process, Beckett's hand brushed Willa's. Skin against skin, his scarred fingers resting briefly on the back of her thin hand over the soft fabric of Josie's shirt. They both looked up at once. Gray met brown. Close. Very close. Close enough for Willa to feel his breath against her forehead, warm, faintly scented with black coffee. Close enough to see the silver strands in his eyes and realize for the first time they weren't cold. They were sad. 1 second. 2. The world paused. Josie babbled between them, unaware that the 2 adults stood on the edge of something neither was ready to name. Then Willa pulled her hand back, quickly, as if she'd touched flame. She rose to her feet, eyes lowered, smoothing her apron though it didn't need smoothing. "I should clean the living room," she said, her voice normal. Too normal, deliberately so. Then she left. Fast, without looking back. Beckett remained seated on the foam mat with Josie in his arms, watching Willa disappear through the doorway, and he felt the absence of her hand against his with a sharp clarity, sharper than any scar on his body, sharper than any knife or bullet he'd ever endured. Those wounds he'd known how to treat. This emptiness, in the place where her hand had been, he had no idea what to do with. Josie started cutting more teeth that Thursday, and the entire mansion filled with crying. Not the soft, manageable whimpers Beckett had grown used to hearing from downstairs in recent weeks. This was raw, desperate, aching, sobbing, the cry of a baby who didn't understand why the world suddenly hurt and had no way to explain that it was unbearable. Willa tried everything. Teething gel, chilled teething rings, rocking, singing, walking the length of the room again and again. Nothing worked. Josie cried through the morning, cried into the afternoon, refused her bottle, refused sleep. Her face flushed red, tears soaking the collar of her tiny shirt. When Beckett came home at 4, 3 hours earlier than usual, and he'd stopped pretending that coming home early had nothing to do with the 2 people downstairs, he found Willa sitting on the living room sofa with Josie in her arms. She was crying. Not just Josie, though Josie was still sobbing. Willa was crying. Silent tears streaming down her cheeks, while she tried to soothe her daughter with a voice gone hoarse from singing all day. Dark circles under her eyes looked almost like bruises. Her shoulders trembled, not from cold but from exhaustion, the kind Beckett recognized in men who'd pushed themselves past their limits for too long. He didn't ask, didn't request permission, didn't explain. He stepped forward, bent down, and gently lifted Josie from Willa's arms. Josie, red-faced and wet with tears and mucus, looked at him with wide, watery green eyes, and cried even louder, as if being transferred to new arms was one more betrayal in an already terrible day. But Beckett didn't hand her back. He settled her against his chest, one hand supporting her small body, the other resting firm and steady against her back, and began to walk. Through the living room, around the dining table, down the hallway, each step slow and even, like the rhythm of a cradle. And he talked, not sang, because Beckett Cole didn't sing and suspected any lullaby from his mouth would only make things worse. He simply spoke in the lowest register of his voice, almost a murmur, about meaningless things, about the Chicago weather, about stock prices he'd read in the morning paper, about how he liked his black coffee. The words didn't matter. The sound did. The steady vibration of his chest beneath her small body. 5 minutes, 10, 15. The crying softened. 20 minutes. Josie let out a tiny but deep sigh. Her body loosened. Her head grew heavier on his shoulder. The small fist gripping his shirt relaxed but didn't let go. She fell asleep. Willa stood at the edge of the living room watching them, her eyes still wet but no longer crying, her mouth slightly open. "You have magic," she whispered. "No," Beckett replied softly so he wouldn't wake the child. "I'm just more stubborn than a teething baby. That's all." Something flickered across Willa's face. Almost a smile. Close, though not quite there, because Willa Byrne wasn't someone who smiled easily, but it was the closest Beckett had seen her come to a real one since the day he met her. They sat on the sofa, Josie asleep against Beckett's chest, breathing gently, her face finally relaxed after a day of pain. Outside the windows, Chicago dimmed into night, city lights flickering like grounded stars, and in that quiet, for the first time, they talked. Not as employer and maid, not in clipped exchanges about chores and schedules, but as two people sitting beside each other in the dark, sharing things they'd both kept buried for years. Willa spoke first. Maybe the darkness made it easier. Maybe exhaustion lowered her guard. "My mother's name was Nell," she said softly, nostalgia woven into her voice. She sold flowers at the Burlington Farmers Market in Vermont. Every Saturday she woke at 4 to cut them fresh. Her hands were always stained with soil, even at church on Sunday, even at parent-teacher meetings. I used to be embarrassed by that when I was little. She paused. Now I'd give anything to see those dirt-stained hands one more time. Silence followed, then a whisper. Lung cancer. She never smoked a day in her life. The doctors said maybe fertilizer, maybe bad luck, maybe no reason at all. She died when I was 19. I had no one after that. Drifted, took whatever jobs I could. Then I met Troy at a rundown bar outside Indianapolis. He was handsome, sweet, knew exactly what a 22-year-old orphan needed to hear. And I, foolish, thought it was love. She didn't elaborate on Troy. She didn't have to. They both knew the rest. Then Willa turned toward Beckett. "And you?" Beckett was quiet for a long moment. Josie breathed steadily against him, warm and trusting. Maybe it was that trust that made him speak. Because if an 8-month-old child could trust him enough to sleep on his chest, maybe he could trust someone enough to tell the truth. "My father's name was Patrick," he said, his voice low and even, the tone of someone recounting a memory buried so deep it no longer seemed to belong to him. "He was shot in a warehouse on the north side when I was 14. 4 bullets. I was there. I saw the blood on the concrete." He looked at me before his eyes closed. Didn't say a word. Not one. He paused. Breathed. 5 years before that, my mother left. Diane. No letter. No call. I woke up one morning and her closet was empty. Just her perfume still on the pillow. Willa didn't interrupt. She listened the way he'd listened to her. "There was a woman," Beckett continued, almost reluctantly. "Paige. 5 years ago. She was the only one who ever got close. The only one I thought might." He didn't finish the sentence. I pushed her away. Told her staying near me was a death sentence. She cried. Asked to stay. I told her to go. Silence settled in the darkened living room. Chicago blinking beyond the glass. Josie breathing steadily. "Aren't you afraid now?" Willa asked quietly. "Letting me and Josie stay here. Letting us be close to you. Aren't you afraid we'll become targets?" Beckett looked down at Josie. At the tiny hand gripping his shirt even in sleep. At the small face finally peaceful after a day of pain. "Terrified," he admitted. "But for the first time in my life, I'm more afraid of losing something than I am of dying. And I don't know what to do with that feeling." Silence settled after Beckett's last words like snow over a city, soft yet transforming everything beneath it. No one spoke again. No one needed to. The truths they'd released into the dark were heavy enough to require time, as if they'd both opened their chests and were now sitting side by side, studying wounds long hidden from the world. Josie slept against Beckett's chest, her breathing steady, her small fist still wrapped in his shirt. The clock ticked on the wall. City lights flickered beyond the window, and Willa, drained from a day of tending to a teething child, emptied from having poured out memories she'd carried alone for years, leaned back into the sofa, her head tipped against the cushion, eyes closing. Her shoulder nearly brushed Beckett's, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her arm, though they didn't quite touch. The space between them was only a few centimeters, thinner than a blade, yet wider than an ocean. Beckett didn't move, didn't dare. He simply looked at her, looked at Willa with her eyes closed, her face finally unguarded now that vigilance had slipped away. And for the first time, he truly saw her. Not Willa the maid, not Willa the single mother, not Willa the victim or the fighter, or any label he'd assigned to her. Just Willa. A 27-year-old woman tired to the bone. A loose strand of brown hair falling across her forehead she didn't have the strength to brush aside. Narrow shoulders beneath gray fabric, the graceful line of her neck as her head leaned back. And on her left wrist, where her sleeve had shifted slightly, Beckett saw the scar. A pale line crossing from the back of her hand toward her wrist. Not self-inflicted. He'd seen enough wounds in his life to know the difference. This was defensive. The mark of something sharp. Glass, maybe. A bottle. A hand raised to block a blow. Troy Landis. Beckett wanted to touch that scar, wanted to lay his finger along the faded white line and say the man who did this would never touch her again. Wanted to brush that strand of hair from her forehead, wanted to rest his hand against the thin shoulder, trembling from cold or exhaustion. But he didn't, because Beckett Cole knew his hands scarred and stained by too much violence, had no right to touch someone gently. Not because he didn't want to, but because he wasn't certain he knew how. Then Willa opened her eyes. Slowly, her heavy lids lifting until brown met gray. She caught him looking. Beckett didn't glance away, didn't pretend he'd been staring at something else. Maybe he was too tired to put the mask back on. Maybe the darkness made him braver. Maybe Josie asleep on his chest gave him a courage no weapon ever had. He simply held her gaze, and she held his. Silence again. The kind that speaks more than language. Then Willa spoke, very softly, as if confessing something to herself rather than to him. For 4 years with Troy, I was never allowed to call him by his name. Beckett's brow shifted slightly, but he didn't interrupt. He made me call him Sir. Always. Sir, dinner's ready. Sir, I'm sorry. Sir, please don't hit me. Her voice was flat, detached, the tone of someone recounting memory from a safe distance, so it can't cut too deeply. Never Troy, never his name. Because a name is intimate, and I didn't have the right to intimacy with him. I was his wife, but I wasn't allowed to speak his name as if we were equals. 4 years like that. She looked down at her hands. After I ran, I realized I'd forgotten what it felt like to say someone's name. Forgotten how it feels to let a name rest on your tongue like it belongs there. 4 years is long enough to forget. Silence. Josie shifted lightly against Beckett's chest, frowned in her sleep, then settled again. And Willa looked up. Straight at him. Brown eyes steady in the dark. And she said it, softer than breath. Beckett. Just one word. His name. Not Mr. Cole. Not Sir. Not the title of a maid addressing her employer. Just his name. Spoken into the dim room by a woman who'd been forbidden to speak a name for 4 years. Beckett. Just Beckett. Not Mr. Cole. He swallowed. His throat felt dry, raw, because he understood what she'd just done. She hadn't simply called him by name. She'd reclaimed something Troy Landis had stolen from her. The right to intimacy. The right to equality. The right to speak a name without fear. She hadn't said it because he was special. She'd said it because saying it was freedom. And she'd chosen his name as the first act of that freedom. All right, he answered, his voice rougher than usual and lower, and he didn't try to correct it. Just Beckett. His name lingered in the darkened Chicago night, in the living room lit only by the city beyond the glass, between two people sitting side by side with a sleeping child between them. More intimate than any touch, more intimate than any kiss, more intimate than any declaration of love Beckett had ever heard or spoken. Because it wasn't love, it was trust. And Willa Byrne, who trusted no one, had trusted him enough to say his name. Beckett sat there in the quiet, Josie warm against him, Willa beside him, his name still echoing in his ears, and he knew with the cold certainty of a man who'd survived everything that he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross, even if he wanted to, even if reason told him he should. Even if 20 years in the underworld screamed that this was the gravest mistake of his life, he was already past it, and he didn't want to go back. The message arrived on a Tuesday afternoon while Willa was feeding Josie in the playroom. Beckett was upstairs on the phone with Volkov discussing the schedule for the second shipment when he heard the spoon fall to the floor, the faint sound of metal touching foam, muffled yet clear enough to stand out in the familiar quiet of the house. He didn't go down immediately, but when the call ended and he checked the security camera out of what had become a new habit, he saw Willa sitting motionless on the playroom floor, her phone in her hand, her face white as paper. Josie sat in her lap, the bowl of porridge tipped over onto the foam mat, but Willa didn't pick it up, didn't wipe it away, didn't move. She only stared at the phone screen with the same look Beckett had seen on many faces in his life, the look of someone who had just been told death was on its way. From that day on, Willa changed. Not in obvious ways, not in a manner a stranger would notice at once, but in small, precise shifts that only someone who had watched her closely would detect. And Beckett had watched her closely. She flinched every time the doorbell rang, even when it was only the delivery man she recognized. She held Josie tighter when carrying her past the windows, one arm cradling her daughter, the other unconsciously shielding the front of her body as if she could form a barrier with her own flesh. Her eyes scanned the glass constantly, quick and sharp, like radar. Each glance only a fraction of a second but repeated every few minutes, and she stopped singing. The mansion lost the soft lullabies Beckett had grown accustomed to, so accustomed that he noticed their absence at once, like realizing something essential was missing only after it was gone. On the 4th day after the message, Beckett couldn't endure it any longer. He waited until Josie was asleep in her crib for her afternoon nap, waited until Willa was dusting the bookshelves in the living room, then stepped in and asked directly, "Who texted you?" It wasn't phrased as a question. Beckett's voice never turned certainty into inquiry. Willa's hand stilled. Her back went rigid. She didn't turn around. No one. Willa. He said her name, and that name, the one she had given him permission to use in the dark on the sofa, carried a weight no other word held. She turned, and Beckett saw fire in her eyes, not the quiet ember he had seen when she refused his offer of more money, but a fierce, uncontrolled blaze that had been compressed too long beneath layers of fear and exhaustion. "This is not your business," she said, her voice higher than usual, sharper, trembling. "I survived 5 years without anyone. I gave birth alone. I raised my daughter alone. I hid her in the laundry room of a Mafia boss and survived. I don't need anyone to save me. I don't need you to solve my problems. I don't need—" She stopped, not because she had run out of words, but because tears came before she could stop them. Beckett watched her cry, not the fragile kind of crying Willa despised, but the furious kind, tears falling while her jaw clenched and her hands curled into fists, the kind of crying born from anger at herself, for letting someone close enough to see her afraid. He didn't step forward, didn't touch her. He knew that in this moment any gesture would feel like pity, and pity was something she hated more than bruises. "I know," he said calmly, not threatening, not comforting, simply stating truth. "I know you survived without anyone. I know you're stronger than most people I've ever met, but you don't have to be alone anymore." Willa looked at him through tears, and Beckett saw her fighting, not with him, but with herself, with the part that wanted to believe him, and the part life had trained to understand that trust is an open door for pain. He didn't press, didn't ask again. He simply stood there and waited for her to decide. That afternoon, Fletcher arrived at the mansion unannounced, which meant something serious. They sat in the 3rd-floor office with the door closed, voices low. "Kieran Walsh," Fletcher said the name like he was spitting it out. "He's probing. Word is you've changed, giving debtors more time, canceling meetings, coming home early. Walsh isn't the type to ignore patterns like that." Beckett listened without expression. Walsh, 45 years old, controlled the South Side. A rival Beckett had kept in balance for 3 years through fear and force. Walsh wasn't as powerful as Beckett, but he was patient. And in this world, patience could be more dangerous than strength. "What else?" Beckett said, not as a question because he knew Fletcher hadn't come merely with rumor. Fletcher met his eyes. "Walsh knows there's a woman and a baby in your house. Not details, but he knows. And you know he'll use them." Silence settled heavy as concrete. Keeping them here meant placing them in danger, turning them into targets, turning Josie, an 8-month-old baby who slept on his chest every night, into a piece on a board she had never chosen to step onto. But sending them away meant losing the only thing in 37 years that had made him feel alive instead of merely existing. Fletcher said nothing more. He didn't need to. They both understood the cost of attachment in their world. Fletcher had seen what happened to the families of other men like them. He knew the endings, and he looked at Beckett with the expression of someone hoping his leader would choose correctly, even though they both knew the correct choice would destroy the only good thing Beckett had ever had. That night, after Fletcher left, after Willa placed Josie in the crib in the playroom and sang softly again, though quieter than before, Beckett sat alone in his office. On the screen before him, the security camera showed the playroom. Willa sat beside the crib, her hand slipped through the bars so Josie could hold her finger in sleep. The yellow light was soft. The mobile of stars and moons turned slowly above the crib. Beckett watched the image, then looked down at the drawer he had opened. Inside lay his gun, cold, black, familiar as a third hand, and beside it a small photograph Ramona had taken the week before and left on his desk without a word. The picture of Josie holding Beckett's finger, 5 tiny fingers wrapped around one large one, green eyes lifted in absolute trust, the gun and the photograph. violence and tenderness, death and life, lying side by side in the same drawer. Beckett Cole stared at them for a long time and understood that this was his life laid bare, everything he had been and everything he was becoming, existing together, clashing, inseparable. And he did not know which one would win. Troy Landis came to Chicago on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the first message. Willa didn't know he was there. She was walking back to the mansion from Arkwrights daycare, Josie in her arms, the baby wearing the pale pink knit hat Ramona had made, a teething ring in her mouth, wide green eyes studying the winter light of Chicago, as if everything in it were miraculous. She cut through the small park along the way, the shortcut she took every day, the place where she had finally begun to feel safe enough to slow her steps and stop looking over her shoulder. "Remember me, Willa," the voice came from the bench to her left. Sweet, low, familiar enough that her body recognized it before her mind did. Everything froze. Her foot halted mid-step. Her arms tightened around Josie so suddenly the baby squirmed in protest. Her heart pounded, but she couldn't feel it, because she was somewhere else entirely, on the kitchen floor of that old house outside Indianapolis, pregnant, tasting blood, hearing heavy footsteps coming toward her. Trauma is not memory, it is a time machine, and for a fraction of a second, Willa Byrne was no longer standing in a Chicago park. She was 23 again, 6 months pregnant, bracing for the next kick. Troy rose from the bench, 31 years old, still handsome, still wearing that smile she once loved before she understood what it concealed. Leather jacket, hands in his pockets, the confident stride of a man who believed the world owed him something. "The kid's grown," he said, looking at Josie. "Looks like me. Got your eyes, though. Pretty," he smiled. "I came because I've changed, Willa. I'm her father. I have the right to see my daughter." And it was the word father that snapped her back from the time machine. Not gently, violently, like a spring released after years of pressure, like the most primal instinct rising from the deepest place in her chest. She stepped back, clutched Josie tighter, turned her body to shield her daughter with her own. "You are not her father," Willa said. Her voice shook. Her eyes did not. She looked straight at Troy Landis, with a fire he had never seen in the 4 years they lived together, because in those 4 years she had never dared to meet his gaze. A father doesn't kick his child in the womb. A father doesn't break her mother's ribs. A father doesn't turn her mother's life into hell. You are not her father. You are the man my daughter will never know. Troy's smile died on his face. He didn't recognize this Willa. He knew the bowed head, the whispered apologies, the trembling yes. Not this woman who looked him in the eye and said no. His expression hardened. The warmth drained. The look she'd seen before every beating darkened his eyes. "What did you just say?" He stepped forward and grabbed her wrist. Squeezed. The same grip her bones remembered. "The grip that meant you belong to me and I can do what I want." Josie screamed. The sound split the quiet park. The terrified cry of a baby who felt violence in the hands clutching her mother. Troy squeezed harder. Willa felt the old pain flare in her wrist. Familiar, sharp. But this time she didn't fold. This time she held Josie. This time she opened her mouth to shout. She didn't need to. Beckett Cole was walking from the far end of the park. He had started picking Willa and Josie up from daycare every afternoon. On foot, not driving. The distance was short, and he had discovered he liked the walk, liked hearing Josie babble in Willa's arms, liked the way late Chicago sunlight caught in her brown hair. He saw them from a distance, saw the stranger, saw his hand on Willa's wrist, saw Josie crying. Beckett did not shout, did not run, did not reach for a weapon. He simply walked. Long, steady strides, quick but not hurried. The walk of a man who already knew what would happen when he arrived, and did not need to rush, because the outcome had been decided before he took the first step. When he reached them, he did not look at Willa, did not look at Josie. He looked directly into Troy Landis's eyes. Then he reached out and took hold of the wrist gripping Willa, and he squeezed. But not the way Troy had squeezed. Troy squeezed to control. Beckett squeezed to inform, to let him know that every bone in his wrist now rested under the authority of a scarred hand that had broken far more than Troy could imagine. Troy released Willa, his face twisted in pain. He looked up at the man half a head taller, gray eyes colder than a Chicago winter. "My name is Beckett Cole," he said quietly, slowly, only loud enough for Troy to hear. "You can look it up. And if you touch her or that child again, I will not call the police. I will handle it myself. And I am very thorough." Troy recognized the name. Beckett saw the exact second recognition struck, the blood draining from his face. The moment he understood whose hand held his wrist, Troy jerked free, stepped back, turned, walked fast, then ran, vanished through the park gate as if he had never existed. Beckett turned. Willa stood there holding Josie, both of them crying. Josie from fear and Willa from something far more complex. And Beckett did something he had never done before. He wrapped his arms around both of them, drew them into his chest, held tight, Josie between them, fully enclosed, her crying softening to whimpers, then to hiccuping breaths, then to steady sleep. Willa pressed her face into Beckett's shoulder, and he felt her tears soak through his shirt, warm against his skin. They stood that way in the winter park among bare trees and empty benches, until Willa finally lifted her head, eyes red but jaw set, and spoke in the voice Beckett respected more than any other. "I was protecting myself before you came. I want you to know that." "I know," he said. "I just don't want you to have to be strong alone anymore." On the walk back, Josie slept on Beckett's shoulder. Willa walked beside him in silence, her hand trembling faintly. Beckett took out his phone with his free hand and called Fletcher. "Troy Landis. Handle it. Don't kill him. But make sure he never sets foot in Illinois again. Ever." Fletcher did not ask why. He answered with one word. "Understood." Willa did not go home that night. Not because Beckett asked her to, but because when they stepped back into the mansion after what happened in the park, when Josie was asleep on Beckett's shoulder and Willa walked beside him on legs that were still trembling, she watched the front door close behind them and realized she did not want it to open again. She did not want to step back out into a world where Troy Landis might be waiting on any bench. For the first time, a Mafia boss's mansion felt safer than the outside world. Beckett laid Josie down in the crib in the playroom. Willa stretched out on the sofa in the adjoining room, refusing the guest bedroom because she needed to be close enough to hear her daughter breathe. She fell asleep within 5 minutes, the deep, total sleep of someone emptied of everything: strength, will, tears. The mansion grew quiet. Josie slept. Willa slept. And Beckett Cole sat alone in his third-floor office, door closed, lights off, the faint blue glow of the security monitor washing over his face. The drawer in front of him stood open. The gun lay on the left. The photograph of Josie holding his finger lay on the right. He looked at both. For a long time. A very long time. And for the first time in his life, Beckett Cole truly did not know what to do. Keeping them here meant what? It meant Walsh would find out. Sooner or later, one way or another, Kieran Walsh would gather enough information. And Walsh was not the kind to attack head-on. Walsh looked for weaknesses and pressed slowly, patiently, until his opponent collapsed from within. Willa and Josie were not weaknesses. They were a breach. The largest breach in the defenses Beckett had built over 20 years. He had seen what happened to the families of other bosses. He had seen the photographs, heard the phone calls, known the endings. And he had once made the correct decision in a situation like this. Paige. 5 years ago. He had told her to leave, and she left, and she was safe. Correct, logical, cold, efficient. That was how Beckett Cole functioned. That was how he survived. He only had to do it again. In the morning, he would tell Willa she and Josie had to go. He would find her a safe place, another city, another state, a new apartment, new names if necessary. He would give her enough money for a fresh start, cut cleanly, like amputating infected flesh to save the body. Painful, but survivable. He began composing the words in his head. "Willa, I need you and Josie to leave." "No, too cold." "Willa, for your safety, and your daughter's, I think it would be best if..." "No," too similar to what he had told Paige. "Willa, tonight I realized that." Realized what? That he was selfish. That every day they stayed he was gambling their lives in exchange for the feeling of being alive. Footsteps on the stairs. Fletcher entered without knocking, which meant it was important enough to ignore courtesy. He stood before Beckett's desk, arms folded, looking at him with an expression Beckett had never seen directed at him before. Not loyalty, not obedience. Pity. "Keeping them is selfish," Fletcher said, his voice flat and undeniable. "You know this world. You know what happens to a boss's family. You've seen it. Marconi's wife, Volkov's daughter, Walsh's nephew. Each name fell like a bullet. Beckett felt every one lodge in his chest. Do you want Willa and Josie to be the next names on that list? Silence. Beckett looked at Fletcher. Fletcher held his gaze. Two men who had stood side by side for 15 years, through blood and violence and everything the underworld could throw at them, stood in a dark office, and both knew the answer. Fletcher nodded once, turned, and left. The door closed. Beckett sat there, alone. Again, always alone. He looked at the gun, looked at the photograph, and began forming the plan. Tomorrow morning, he would tell her tomorrow morning. He would arrange safety, provide money, ensure they wanted for nothing. Let go. As he had let Paige go, watch them leave, close the door, return to his old life, continue existing, if that was the word for it. The decision was made. Cold, logical, efficient. The Beckett-Cole way. Then the cry came from downstairs. Not the sharp cry of teething pain. A frightened cry. The startled cry of a baby waking in the dark and not seeing anyone familiar. Josie. Beckett stood before. He consciously chose to stand. His legs were moving before his mind could remind him he had just decided to let go. His hand gripped the banister before he could think that Willa should handle it. He went down the stairs, through the dark hallway, to the playroom. The door was slightly open, soft yellow nightlight glowing, and Josie was standing in her crib, tiny hands gripping the white rails, legs trembling because she had only just learned to stand, green eyes wet with tears, mouth twisted as she cried. In the next room Willa slept on, exhaustion so deep her daughter's cry did not wake her. Josie cried, looked around, searching, and when her gaze found Beckett in the doorway, the crying stopped. Not gradually, instantly, like a switch flipped, as if his presence alone answered every fear in the dark. She looked at him, eyes still wet, lips still quivering, but silent. Then she lifted her arms, both small hands reaching toward him, not toward the doorway where her mother slept, toward him, choosing him. Beckett stepped to the crib, bent down, slid his hands beneath her arms and lifted her. She rested her head on his shoulder at once, one hand gripping his shirt, her face pressed to his neck, and sighed. A soft, feather-light sigh, the sigh of a baby who has found safety, and she fell back asleep, quickly, simply, as if the nightmare had never existed. Beckett stood there in the dim playroom, the mobile of stars and moons turning slowly above the empty crib, holding the sleeping child against his shoulder. And he knew, with absolute certainty, clearer than any strategy or business decision he had ever made, he could not let them go. The plan for morning no longer existed. The prepared words dissolved. Cold logic dissolved. Not because he was strong, not because he was brave, but because this 8-month-old baby, who did not know who he was or what he had done or how dangerous his world could be, had looked into the darkness, seen him, and chosen him. Chosen to lift her arms toward him above anyone else in the world. And Beckett-Cole, the man no one had chosen, whose mother left, whose father died before his eyes, whose lover he pushed away, could not look into those green eyes of absolute trust and say, "I will leave you too." He stood in the dark holding Josie and let go of the plan to let go. The next morning, sunlight poured into the mansion through the tall glass windows, the rare kind of Chicago winter light, pale gold and gentle, spilling across the kitchen floor like silk laid out by careful hands. Beckett woke earlier than usual, not because of an alarm or habit, but because of sound. The clink of a pan against the stove, the soft hiss of oil, the steady stir of a spoon in a bowl, and woven through it all, Josie's voice, the rhythmic thump of a small hand striking something solid, followed by delighted babble that she seemed convinced the entire world needed to hear. He pulled on a shirt, left the top buttons undone, and went downstairs barefoot, following the sound into the kitchen. He stopped in the doorway. Willa stood at the stove with her back to him. She wore one of the loose t-shirts Ramona had found for her, slipping off one shoulder, her brown hair tied high, exposing the pale line of her neck. She was frying eggs while stirring porridge with her other hand, moving between burners with the fluid ease of someone who had cooked all her life, graceful and instinctive, like a quiet dance. Josie sat in the high chair Beckett had bought the week before, gripping a plastic spoon and pounding it against the tray as if playing a drum, laughing every time the sound answered her effort. Sunlight caught in her brown curls and turned them honey gold. It brushed Willa's bare shoulder, curled through the steam rising from the pot, reflected softly in the glass cabinets, framing mother and child in warm light. Beckett stood there without stepping forward because he was looking at something he hadn't known. He'd been longing for all 37 years of his life. Not money, not power, not territory or deals worth millions. This, a sunlit kitchen, a woman making breakfast, a baby laughing and banging a spoon, the scent of eggs and coffee and oatmeal, the sound of life, of home. He stepped inside. Willa turned, saw him, and something softened in her face. Not quite a smile, but the absence of defense, which Beckett had learned was rarer and more valuable than any smile. Josie spotted him and squealed with joy, lifting the plastic spoon toward him like a triumphant banner. Beckett walked straight to the high chair, bent down, and kissed Josie's forehead, gently, naturally, as if he had done it every morning of his life. His lips touched her warm skin, carrying the faint scent of milk and powder, and Josie laughed, dropping the spoon to clap her hands against his cheeks. He lifted his head and met Willa's eyes. She stood by the stove, spoon suspended in midair, watching him with an expression he could not fully read. Not surprise, not anger, something deeper and more fragile, as if she had just witnessed something she barely dared believe was real. And Beckett realized what he had done. He had kissed Josie's forehead without thinking, like a father, as if he had the right, as if he belonged there. "I'm sorry," he said. "I shouldn't have." "Don't apologize," Willa said softly, lowering the spoon. "Don't ever apologize for that." Silence held for a moment while sunlight continued to pour in, and Josie resumed her enthusiastic drumming. Beckett spoke again before he fully knew what he meant to say. "I'm not good at this." His voice was lower, rougher, and he hated that it made him sound vulnerable. Though perhaps he was. "I know how to negotiate deals worth millions. I know how to give orders. I know how to threaten. But this, I don't know how to do this." He looked down at his scarred hand and then back up. "But I know that every afternoon when you and Josie leave, I count the minutes until morning when you come back. I know that for the first time in 2 years this house feels like a home instead of an empty fortress. And I know I don't want to lose that." Willa set the spoon down slowly. Her hand trembled. "Beckett, I'm a broke single mother. I sleep on your sofa because I'm afraid of my ex-husband. I don't have money, or a house, or anything. I have nothing to give you. You give me a reason to come home," Beckett said, and the voice that the Chicago underworld feared shook for the first time. 37 years. "I've never had a reason. Don't tell me you have nothing." Willa looked at him, tears gathering but not yet falling, held back by sheer will. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "Afraid you're a dream. Afraid that playroom is a dream. Afraid all of this is a dream. And that one morning I'll wake up back in the laundry room on that thin mattress with the cracked bottle wrapped in tape and realize it was never real." Beckett stepped closer, slowly, giving her space to pull away if she wished. She did not. He lifted his hand, the one marked by a long scar, and touched her cheek. His skin was rough against hers, the hand that had caused pain resting against the face of a woman who had endured too much of it. And somehow the contrast did not feel wrong. It felt right, in a way nothing else in Beckett's life ever had. "This isn't a dream," he said, so quietly it was almost breath. "And if it is, I won't let anyone wake you." Willa closed her eyes. A tear slipped down, warm and real against his fingers. Then she opened them again and looked at him. Beckett leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She didn't. His lips met hers, soft and trembling. They both trembled. His first kiss in 5 years. Her first kiss since she learned that a kiss did not have to taste like blood. Slow, gentle. So real it left them both slightly unsteady when they parted. Josie, ignored longer than was acceptable for an 8-month-old, slammed her spoon against the tray and clapped her hands as if she understood perfectly and approved. Willa laughed through tears. Beckett looked at Josie, then at Willa, then at the sunlit kitchen, and for the first time on the face feared by the entire Chicago underworld, a smile appeared. Not wide, not dazzling, just the faint lift of a corner of his mouth, the softening of his eyes, but it was the truest smile Beckett Cole had ever worn. 3 months after that first kiss in the sunlit kitchen, Beckett Cole was still Beckett Cole, still the Mafia boss of Chicago, still the name spoken in lowered voices in the dark alleys on the South Side. The underworld did not disappear simply because a man learned how to love, but Beckett operated differently, not softer, more dangerous, because now he had something to lose. And a man with something to lose fights more ruthlessly than any man with nothing. Kieran Walsh realized that too late. When Walsh began applying pressure, testing alliances, probing the loyalty of Beckett's partners, he did not know Beckett was already 3 moves ahead. A new alliance with Dmitry Volkov, negotiated during the very weeks Beckett had appeared distracted, had in fact been constructed with precision to box Walsh in from the north and the east. Walsh was not brought down by gunfire. He was brought down by strategy, by a man who went home each night, watched his daughter sleep, and understood that failure was no longer an option. Fletcher stood in the 3rd-floor office after Walsh officially withdrew from the south side, looking at Beckett with something unfamiliar in his eyes. Not surprise. Something closer to a new kind of respect, different from the old respect rooted in fear. "You've changed since the baby came," Fletcher said. "No," Beckett replied without lifting his gaze from the papers on his desk. "I changed when I had a reason to come home." Fletcher said nothing more. But as he left, Beckett saw the faintest curve at the corner of his lieutenant's mouth, the first in 15 years. Josie was now almost 11 months old and learning to walk, more accurately, learning how to fall with style. She would pull herself up on the crib rail, let go, stand for a brave 1.5 seconds, then drop onto her diapered bottom and laugh as if falling were the finest game in the world. But when Beckett held out his hand, when those large, scarred fingers hovered in front of her, Josie would take hold and step. Wobbly, tiny feet trembling across the hardwood floor. 1 step, 2, 3, holding his finger with absolute faith that he would never let go. Willa sat on the sofa, filming with the new phone Beckett had bought her. And she was laughing. Truly laughing. Not almost laughing, not on the edge of it, but a full sound rising from deep in her chest, free and unrestrained. The kind of laughter Willa Byrne had forgotten during 4 years with Troy Landis, and the long years of surviving alone. That laughter filled the mansion, poured into corners and hallways that had once known only silence and shadow. Ramona stood in the kitchen doorway, dish towel in hand, watching Beckett guide Josie step by unsteady step while Willa laughed and recorded. And the 58-year-old housekeeper, who had served the Cole family for 3 decades, lifted a hand to her eyes. "I've worked for the Cole family 30 years, she murmured, whether Beckett heard or not. His father never laughed. Not once. That night the Lincoln Park mansion settled into the kind of quiet Beckett had learned to cherish. Not the hollow quiet of the years he lived alone, but a full quiet. The soft rhythm of Josie's breathing against his chest, the faint shift of Willa beside him, the low hum of the heater and the distant wind off Lake Michigan brushing the windows. Josie lay on his chest as she had since that first night, since the marble hallway where she had crawled to him and lifted her arms. Her tiny hand wrapped around his finger even in sleep, 5 small fingers curled tight as if she knew, even in dreams, that this finger was her anchor. Willa curled at his side, her head near his shoulder, brown hair spread across the pillow. She slept deeply. For the first time in many years, Willa Byrne slept without flinching, without checking locks in her mind, without listening for footsteps, without planning escape. She slept like someone who had finally found safety. The mansion now held laughter, crying, the thud of toys on foam mats, Josie's babbling attempts at saying da-da, and though none of the 3 adults were entirely certain whom she meant, Beckett quietly hoped it was him. Willa's singing in the kitchen, Ramona's affectionate scolding when someone spilled porridge, the sounds of life in a house that had once felt as cold as a tomb. The phone on the table beside the sofa vibrated. The screen lit up. Fletcher's name. Beckett looked at it. He knew what the call meant. Walsh was regrouping. The underworld never slept, never rested, never allowed anyone peace for long. He looked at the phone, then at Josie, her small hand still wrapped around his finger. Eyes closed, mouth slightly open, breath light as a butterfly's wing. Then at Willa, her face finally unguarded in sleep. No fear, no defense, just peace. Beckett reached out, picked up the phone, turned it off, set it face down. Walsh would still be there in the morning. The underworld would still be there in the morning. Everything would still be there in the morning. But tonight belonged to him. Tonight belonged to this room, the baby on his chest, the woman at his side. Tonight he was not Beckett Cole, the Mafia boss. He was only Beckett. Beckett Cole had built an empire on blood and fear. He had controlled men through power and violence. He had lived 37 years, believing control was strength and emotion was weakness. But the one thing he was truly proud of, the one thing he would fight to his final breath to protect, was not territory, or money, or power. It was the tiny hand wrapped around his finger each night, the laughter in a sunlit kitchen, his name on the lips of a woman who had given him a reason to come home, and that, chosen by a child too young to understand fear, was the only power Beckett Cole truly wished to keep. Today's story leaves us with a simple yet profound truth that real power does not rest in wealth or status, but in the ability to love and to be loved. Sometimes it is the smallest and most fragile among us who possess the strength to soften hearts we believed had turned to stone. No matter what past you have endured, no matter the scars you carry, there is always a chance to begin again, if you are willing to open your heart when love knocks, even when it arrives in the most unexpected form. If this story touched your heart, please press like so we know you are listening. Share this video with those you love, with anyone who needs to believe that beauty still exists in the middle of hardship, and subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss the moving stories we share each day. We would truly love to know how this story made you feel. Did you see yourself in Willa, in Beckett, or in someone else entirely? Have you ever met someone who changed your life in a way you never expected? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts from the depths of your heart, because every story deserves to be heard. We wish all of you watching good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace. Goodbye for now, and we will see you in the next video.